All right, here's the lineup for today's top stories. We've got the Iran war standoff, Trump's global sanctions, shaping the U.S. midterms, Trump's campaign trail rhetoric, UK politics in turmoil, and finally, Lewinsky's public reflection. We are moving straight from massive global conflicts and economic blockades all the way down to the individual actors driving domestic political maps and our cultural conversations. Starting off with Section 1, the Iran war standoff, ceasefires and Congress. We're kicking things off at the Global Conflict Desk, where a major standoff is brewing between the White House and U.S. lawmakers over the ongoing military situation with Iran. So, the absolute crux of this tension comes down to a law from back in 1973 called the War Powers Resolution. Now, this legislation was originally passed to check presidential power right after the Vietnam War. It basically represents this constant historical push and pull between the executive branch wanting military agility and the legislative branch doing its constitutional duty of oversight. Today, it is smack in the center of the Iran debate. By law, a U.S. president actually has to get Congress's approval within 60 days of notifying them about military action. If they don't get it, they are legally required to just cease hostilities. Following the dates here lays out this legal and political friction perfectly. Look at this. Hostilities began on February 28th, and Congress was formally notified on March 2nd. That puts the 60-day deadline exactly on May 1st. But here is where the interpretation of the law gets super contested. President Trump formally told lawmakers that because a ceasefire went into effect on April 7th, the hostilities have essentially terminated. His argument? That 60-day deadline for legislative approval just doesn't apply anymore. Critics and a bunch of legal experts, however, push back on that. They argue that a temporary ceasefire absolutely does not permanently end a conflict, meaning that 60-day clock, it technically never stopped ticking. And you might be wondering, why does this legal debate matter directly to you? Well, it matters because the broader U.S. blockade on Iran remains fully in place. This whole standoff has totally stalled regional shipping through crucial, highly congested channels like the Strait of Hormuz. And the result? It's driving average U.S. gas prices up to a staggering $4.50 a gallon. It's a pretty stark reminder that abstract constitutional debates over in Washington can really quickly translate to very real concerns about your wallet, broader economic impacts, and honestly, the looming specter of a global recession. The geopolitical ripple effects here are just massive, too. Amidst all this pressure in the Middle East, the U.S. has decided to pull 5,000 troops out of Germany. This reduction in forces is happening right in the middle of a strategic row between the U.S. and European allies. Because several allied nations fiercely disagree with the current approach to the Iran standoff, diplomatic fissures are forming, and it's prompting this massive reshuffling of military assets. It really shows how rapidly a conflict in the Middle East can completely reshape decades-old defense postures over in Europe. Moving right along to Section 2, Trump's global sanctions pressuring Cuba. Let's shift over to Latin America and see how this theme of international pressure builds into a much broader picture of foreign policy. The White House is currently using some really strict economic leverage to ramp up pressure on Havana following recent regional unrest. The Trump administration is justifying this new wave of sanctions by citing terrorism and human rights abuses, explicitly targeting individuals and groups linked to the Cuban government's security forces. Havana, however, reacted incredibly sharply to this economic squeeze. Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez issued a statement calling the expanded restrictions, which essentially recreate a severe fuel blockade, a blatant violation of the UN Charter. He actually referred to the sanctions as collective punishment on everyday citizens, folks who are already enduring frequent and debilitating power blackouts. All right, on to Section 3, shaping the U.S. midterms, redrawing the maps. Now we're shifting gears back to U.S. domestic strategy to see how long-term gambits are playing out right now in the courts. The Supreme Court just handed down a ruling that is going to fundamentally alter the landscape for the upcoming 2026 midterm elections. What is truly wild here is the sheer scale of the potential shift before a single vote is even cast. According to an analysis by Democracy Docket, the recent Supreme Court ruling in Louisiana v. Callais alters decades of Voting Rights Act precedent. What does that mean? It essentially gives the GOP a legal green light to redraw congressional maps across a bunch of key states. When you tally up the potential redistricting in places like Texas, Ohio, Florida, and Louisiana, Republicans could potentially net up to 18 new House districts. It's honestly a masterclass in how legal strategy directly engineers electoral reality. Let's hit Section 4, Trump's campaign trail rhetoric, loyalty, and attacks.
Staying with U.S. politics for a minute, the campaign trail rhetoric is heating up big time. It is defining internal party loyalty and driving deep cultural conversations as the election cycle accelerates.
For instance, the demand for lockstep loyalty comes with incredibly high political stakes right now. Take South Carolina Representative Nancy Mace, for example. She's currently running for governor, and reports are indicating that her vocal push to release the Jeffrey Epstein files has seriously infuriated key Trump allies. This internal clash over messaging could potentially cost her a crucial presidential endorsement in what is a very tight Republican primary race. It really goes to show that going against the grain of party leadership carries immediate consequences.
Meanwhile, the tone of the broader campaign remains highly charged. Down at a recent rally in Florida, President Trump drew widespread attention for his rhetoric regarding Somali Americans and Representative Ilhan Omar. During the event, he mocked her origins and made several claims about her personal life and background. Now, to be clear, these specific statements have been previously investigated by news organizations, and no evidence was found to support them. The whole event really underscores just how deeply personal and aggressive the political discourse has become out on the campaign trail. Crossing the Atlantic now for Section 5, UK Politics in Turmoil, Leadership and Energy. Over at our UK desk, the Labour Party is facing some severe internal maneuvering and a deep ideological clash, specifically concerning national security, the economy, and ultimately, who gets to lead. Allies of Greater Manchester Mayor Andy Burnham, a guy often dubbed the King of the North, are quietly putting together a radical 10-year growth plan. And guys, this isn't just some minor policy tweak. This sweeping proposal includes enacting proportional representation and totally overhauling the inheritance tax. The ultimate unspoken goal of all this maneuvering? To get Burnham back into Westminster and potentially challenge current Prime Minister Keir Starmer's premiership within weeks. And the craziest part is it depends entirely on the fragile outcome of upcoming local elections.
This relentless behind-the-scenes plotting to oust leaders actually prompted former Conservative Prime Minister John Major to speak out. He heavily criticized the rapid turnover at the top of UK politics, issuing a pretty stark warning. He noted that treating the government like a game show completely ignores the real, everyday problems that ordinary people are desperately relying on their elected officials to actually solve.
And speaking of real, everyday problems, one of the most massive, undeniable issues for the UK right now is energy security. Given all the intense global focus on green initiatives and climate pledges we've seen lately, this next statistic is genuinely surprising. Ready for this? Only 21.3% of the UK's energy currently comes from electricity. Yeah, you heard that right. Despite all the public push for clean power, the vast majority of the nation's energy infrastructure still relies super heavily on oil and gas just to keep the lights on and keep homes warm. This stark energy reality has sparked a fierce internal debate over the best path forward. Let's look at the two sides. On one hand, you have the Tony Blair Institute arguing for immediate North Sea oil drilling. They're making the case that tapping local fossil fuels is absolutely necessary right now to secure the grid and lower costs for everyday citizens. But on the other side, you have Energy Secretary Ed Miliband pushing for strict decarbonization. He's arguing that halting drilling is completely essential if they're going to meet the nation's binding net zero climate goals. It's your classic high-stakes clash, immediate national security needs going head-to-head with long-term environmental targets. Finally, we arrive at Section 6, Lewinsky's public reflection 25 years later. We are moving away from active geopolitics for a minute to focus on a deeply personal reflection. We're looking back at one of Washington's most explosive historical scandals to really try and understand the human element behind the headlines. Because, let's face it, historical global events are so often driven by deeply vulnerable, surprisingly human emotions. More than 25 years later, Monica Lewinsky candidly admitted on a recent podcast that her intense desire for validation fueled the decisions she made back in her early 20s. She acknowledged that wanting to feel special ultimately placed her at the absolute center of the Bill Clinton impeachment storm. It is such a fascinating insight into the psychology of power dynamics in Washington. It kind of reminds us that these huge, world-shaping events often start with basic human flaws and just a simple desire to belong. Which brings us right to the core of today's explainer. From the incredibly high stakes of the War Powers Act and the quiet strategic maneuvering to redraw electoral maps, all the way down to those deeply personal choices made in the halls of power, we are witnessing a massive global chess match. So the big question is, as global crises merge with rapid domestic political gambits, what long-term consequences will today's relentless pursuit of power have on tomorrow's stability? When leadership feels like a game show and conflicts stretch all the way from Iran to Cuba, what is the ultimate cost of that stability? Thank you so much for exploring these sources with me today, and keep asking the tough questions.